canvas burns against bare skin. A heavy gymnasium door slams shut, sealing off the California heat, trapping the stench of wintergreen and old leather inside. Most legends are built on stage lights and wirework. This one started with a chalky mat, a torn shoelace, and a bruised ego. Jean wiped a streak of dirty sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a gray smudge across his brow. He dropped the heavy leather focus mitts onto the wooden floorboards. They hit with a dull, wet thud, sounding exactly like a side of beef hitting a butcher's block. The Oakland gym was a sauna of trapped breath and cheap floor wax. It smelled of ammonia, old canvas, and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. In the center of the ring, Bruce stood with his hands on his hips. He didn't look like a cinematic god. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in 3 days. His ribs pressed tight against his damp gray t-shirt, rising and falling in shallow, rapid increments. He was nursing a low-grade ache in his left knee, a persistent throbbing that flared up whenever the coastal humidity spiked. He spat into a dented tin bucket in the corner, the sound pinging sharply in the cavernous room. From the shadows near the weight racks, a throat cleared. It was a wet, gravelly sound. Roxanne pushed herself off the peeling plaster wall. She was a catch wrestler, a veteran of the grueling, unglamorous barnstorming circuits of the Midwest. She had spent a decade twisting joints in damp basements, getting her ears cauliflowered for $50 a night, smelling the cheap beer and stale cigarette smoke of crowds who wanted blood, not art. Roxanne was 5'10", broad-shouldered and thick through the hips and core. Her forearms looked like braided rope. She didn't have time for philosophy. She believed in leverage, mass, and the undeniable truth of a broken collarbone. "It's pretty," Roxanne said. Her voice echoed, flat and devoid of warmth. Bruce didn't turn around immediately. He dragged a ratty yellowed towel over his face, letting the rough terry cloth scrape against his jawline. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The exhaustion wasn't physical. It was the bone-deep weariness of a man who constantly had to prove that gravity applied to him differently than it did to everyone else. Every new city, every new gym, there was always someone standing in the shadows, waiting to tear down the architecture he was building. "Pretty doesn't pay the rent," Bruce replied, his voice raspy, tossing the towel onto the ropes. He finally turned to look at her. Roxanne stepped into the light spilling from the frosted skylight. She was taping her knuckles with dirty white athletic tape, tearing it with her teeth. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes. You're fast, I'll give you that. You snap your punches like a middleweight boxer and you kick like a mule, but it's all air. It's distance." Jean, standing near the bucket, shifted uncomfortably. "Roxanne, we're just doing pad work. It's drill time." "Shut up, Jean," Roxanne said, not taking her eyes off Bruce. She took another step toward the mat. The rubber soles of her wrestling boots squeaked sharply against the polished wood. "You guys put this guy on a pedestal because he looks good on camera, because he talks fast and quotes dead philosophers. But fighting isn't a geometry lesson. It's a car crash." Bruce tilted his head slightly. A drop of sweat traced the line of his jaw and fell onto his collarbone. He didn't smile. The cinematic smirk was for the cameras. Here, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, he just looked annoyed. "You have a point to make? Or do you just like the sound of your own voice?" "My point," Roxanne said, stopping at the edge of the canvas, "is that if you let someone inside that fancy kicking range, you're dead. You're 140 pounds soaking wet. If I get my hands on you, all that snapping and popping goes out the window. You put me in a clinch, you suffocate." The gym went completely silent. The only sound was the distant rhythmic squeak of a ceiling fan struggling on its bearings. Arthur, a younger student tying his shoes on the bleachers, froze with a lace half pulled in his hand. Bruce walked slowly toward the edge of the mat, his bare feet padding softly on the canvas. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The height difference was marginal, but Roxanne had at least 40 pounds of dense, farm-grown muscle on him. "You think fighting is about pulling someone to the floor and laying on them," Bruce said, his tone conversational, almost bored. "I think fighting is about surviving," Roxanne shot back. "And if the bell rings and I decide to take you down, you wouldn't survive my first move. You wouldn't even see it coming. I'd fold you up before you could throw one of those pretty little back fists." Bruce stared at her. He felt a familiar, ugly knot tightening in his stomach, a mix of pride and the base, primal urge to hurt someone who doubted him. He hated this part of himself. He preached emotional control, flowing like water, but the truth was, his temper was a frayed live wire. He had to consciously swallow the rising bile. He didn't strike a pose, he didn't bow. He just looked down at his taped wrists, picked at a loose thread on his knuckles, and sighed. It was the heavy, reluctant sigh of a man being asked to take out the garbage in the rain. "Prove it," Bruce said. Roxanne didn't hesitate. She didn't bother warming up. She simply kicked off her heavy boots, leaving them in a messy pile on the floorboards, and stepped onto the mat in thick woolen socks. She smelled of tiger balm and stale coffee. She rolled her massive shoulders, the joints popping loudly in the quiet room. Bruce walked to the center of the mat. He didn't drop into his wide, cinematic stance. He stood remarkably casual, his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands resting lightly near his waist. His breathing changed. It slowed, becoming deep and measured, inflating his ribs laterally. The annoyance faded from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. "No striking to the face," Jean called out from the corner, his voice cracking slightly. "We don't need anyone missing work on Monday." "I'm not going to hit him," Roxanne muttered, her eyes locked on Bruce's hips. "I'm going to break him in half." Roxanne knew her trade. She knew that striking with a faster man was suicide. Her strategy was simple, brutal, and historically foolproof against smaller opponents. Crowd the space, absorb whatever insignificant impact came first, secure the double leg, and drop her full body weight onto his sternum. Once on the ground, she would wrap him in a cradle and squeeze until he tapped or passed out. She began to circle. She moved with surprising grace for a woman her size, her center of gravity low, her arms slightly outstretched, hunting for a grip. Bruce mirrored her, but his footwork was entirely different. He didn't step. He glided. The friction between his bare soles and the canvas produced a soft, rhythmic hiss-hiss sound. He was giving her space, but not too much. He was managing the distance by fractions of an inch, forcing her to constantly recalibrate her depth perception. Roxanne grew impatient. The psychological pressure of Bruce's silence was grating on her nerves. She decided to force the issue. She feinted a jab to his chest, looking for a reaction. Bruce didn't even blink. He just swayed his upper body a millimeter out of range. The miss infuriated her. "Here it comes," she hissed through her teeth. Roxanne dropped her level violently, her knees bending, her back straight. It was a textbook shoot. She lunged forward with the explosive power of a sprinter leaving the blocks. Her lead foot slammed onto the canvas, sending a shockwave through the floorboards. She reached out, her thick, calloused hands aiming to clasp tightly behind Bruce's knees, her shoulder driving directly toward his midsection. It was the move that had won her dozens of matches in smoky arenas. It was an avalanche, but the avalanche hit empty space. Bruce didn't back away. Backing away from a shoot was a rookie mistake. It just gave the grappler momentum to run you over. Instead, he did something utterly counterintuitive, something that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He stepped into her attack, but at a sharp, 45-degree angle. As Roxanne's mass surged forward, Bruce's lead leg pivoted sharply. The humid air in the gym seemed to snap. He didn't try to muscle her off. He used a fundamental principle of Wing Chun, modified by his own brutal pragmatism. He intercepted her energy. As her shoulder aimed for his waist, Bruce's right hand dropped like a stone. The heel of his palm collided with the back of Roxanne's neck, right at the base of her skull. It wasn't a strike meant to knock her out. It was a heavy structural check. Simultaneously, his left forearm jammed under her right armpit, acting as a fulcrum. The sensory feedback was instantaneous and jarring. Roxanne felt the rough texture of his calluses against her damp skin. She smelled the sharp, sour scent of his sweat, but more terrifyingly, she felt her momentum being hijacked. She had committed 180 pounds of mass moving forward at maximum velocity. Bruce didn't stop it. He just gave it a steering wheel and yanked it off a cliff. With his hand on her neck and his forearm under her shoulder, Bruce violently shifted his hips. He stepped his back foot entirely out of the way, creating a void where his body had just been. He pulled down on her neck and shoved upward into her armpit, twisting her spinal column just enough to destroy her balance. Roxanne's legs kept driving, but her upper body was suddenly forced toward the floor. The friction of the canvas tore at the skin of her knee as she tried to plant a foot to stop her fall. It was useless. She was completely airborne, her center of gravity ripped out from under her. She slammed face first into the chalky mat with a sickening thwack. The impact forced the air from her lungs in a wet, ragged gasp. A cloud of fine, white dust exploded around her face, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with the taste of old rubber. Her teeth clicked together painfully. Before she could even register the shock, before she could scramble to her hands and knees, Bruce was there. He hadn't stepped back to admire his work. He had followed her down like a shadow. Roxanne felt a sharp, agonizing pressure in her right arm. Bruce had smoothly transitioned the underhook into a standing armbar. He had his shin pressed ruthlessly against her neck, pinning her face to the mat. His hips were sunk low, locking her elbow against his thigh. He wasn't yanking on the joint to snap it. He was slowly, methodically applying just enough torque to stretch the ligaments to their absolute breaking point. The pain was immediate and blinding, a hot wire of agony shooting from her elbow straight into her chest. She tried to thrash, to use her weight to roll him. She tensed her thick core, digging her toes into the mat, but she couldn't move. He wasn't holding her with muscle, he was holding her with geometry. Every angle of her body was compromised. The more she struggled, the tighter the lock became. Bruce looked down at her. His chest was barely heaving. The erratic, angry energy from before the fight was gone. He looked completely detached, almost bored again. His eyes were dark, unblinking pools. "Your move," Bruce said quietly, his voice barely louder than the squeaking ceiling fan. "Did I survive it?" Roxanne lay there, her cheek pressed against the rough, dusty canvas. The smell of wintergreen was overpowering now. She could feel the pulse pounding violently in her own neck, right where Bruce's shin was digging in. She hated him in that moment, but more than that, she felt a cold, sinking realization washing over her. She hadn't grabbed a man. She had grabbed a steel cable snapping under tension, a violent shift in physics that she had entirely miscalculated. She slapped her left hand against the mat twice. Tap, tap. Bruce immediately released the pressure. He didn't gloat. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He simply stepped back, took a deep breath, and rubbed his sore knee. He turned his back on her and walked over to the dented tin bucket. He picked up his ratty towel, wiped the sweat from his neck, and looked over at Jean. "Set the timer," Bruce said, his voice raw. 3-minute rounds. Let's get back to work." Roxanne didn't immediately stand. She stayed on her knees for a long minute, cradling her right arm against her rib cage. The joint felt incredibly loose, a sickening sensation of structural instability masked by a rapidly swelling, radiating heat. Every time she breathed, the slight shift of her shoulder sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She stared at the fine weave of the canvas inches from her nose, counting the tiny broken threads. She tasted copper. She had bitten the inside of her cheek when her chin struck the floor. Slowly, awkwardly, she planted her left hand and pushed herself up. Her heavy wool sock slipped slightly on a patch of her own sweat. She didn't look at Bruce. She didn't look at Jean, whose mouth was still slightly open in a silent, shocked oval. She simply trudged toward the peeling wooden bleachers along the far wall, favoring her right side, moving with the stiff mechanical gait of a woman 20 years older. Frank, the balding gym manager who usually stayed half asleep behind the front desk, appeared with a leaky plastic bag filled with crushed ice. He didn't say a word. He just left it on the bench next to her and walked away, his keys jangling loudly in the quiet room. Roxanne sat. She pressed the freezing, dripping bag against her elbow. The intense cold was a sharp shock that barely cut through the deep throbbing ache in her ligaments. She leaned her head back against the concrete wall. The plaster was cool and rough against her scalp. In the center of the ring, the rhythmic violence resumed. Smack, smack, crack. Bruce was hitting the leather focus mitts Jean held, but the rhythm was entirely different now. Before the confrontation, his strikes had been fluid, playful even. Now there was a jagged, ugly edge to them. He wasn't practicing, he was punishing the leather. The sound echoed off the high corrugated ceiling, sharp as a rifle crack. Roxanne watched him from the shadows. The anger she expected to feel, the hot, blinding rage of a public humiliation, wasn't there. Instead, there was a cold, clinical void. She analyzed his movement. She stripped away the cinematic aura, the magazine covers, the television rumors, and looked only at the mechanics. He was fast, yes, but it was more than velocity. It was a terrifying economy of motion. When he threw a cross, his shoulder, hip, and heel moved as a single locked unit. He didn't waste a millimeter of space. Yet, watching closely, she saw the cracks in the porcelain. After a particularly vicious roundhouse kick, Bruce landed heavily on his left leg. He disguised it quickly with a pivot, but Roxanne had spent her life reading bodies in pain. She saw the microscopic wince. She saw the way he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to his right side when standing still. The man was carrying an injury, a deep structural flaw that he was masking with sheer stubborn aggression. "Higher!" Bruce snapped, his voice tight. Jean blinked, raising the mitts an inch. "Bruce, you're drifting to the right. Watch your base." "Just hold the pads, Jean," Bruce fired back, his tone dripping with an unwarranted venom. He threw a 1-2 combination. The power was there, but the timing was a fraction of a second off. The adrenaline dump from the sudden violent encounter with Roxanne was crashing hard, leaving behind a toxic residue of irritability and exhaustion. Bruce stopped. He dropped his hands and stared at the floor, his chest heaving. He rubbed his face vigorously with both hands, dragging the skin down around his eyes. He looked incredibly small in that moment. Stripped of the kinetic blur of his movement, he was just a physically exhausted man in a damp t-shirt, fighting against the limitations of his own anatomy. Roxanne shifted on the bleachers. The ice had melted into a lukewarm puddle inside the bag, dripping steadily onto her canvas trousers. Her elbow felt like it was packed with wet sand and crushed glass. She realized then why Bruce had reacted so violently to her challenge. It wasn't arrogance. Arrogance would have laughed her off. It was survival. He was building an empire on the premise that technique could overcome mass, that the smaller man didn't have to be the victim. Every time a heavier, stronger fighter stepped into his gym and threatened to expose the fragility of that premise, Bruce had to tear them down completely. If he showed a single moment of vulnerability, the entire mythology he was constructing would collapse. It was a miserable, suffocating way to live. Roxanne knew something about that. She had spent her career in the carnivals and the gritty regional circuits, constantly having to prove she wasn't just a novelty act, breaking fingers and choking women unconscious just to earn the right to be taken seriously by the promoters smoking cigars at ringside. "Take 5, Bruce muttered to Jean, turning his back on the center of the room. He walked to the corner, grabbed his tin water bottle, and drank greedily. Water spilled down his chin, soaking into his shirt. He didn't wipe it away. He stood leaning against the rope, staring blankly at the frosted skylight. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the gym floor. An hour passed. The air in the gym grew heavy and stagnant as the sun baked the tar roof directly overhead. Jean had packed his gear and left with a quiet nod. Arthur, the younger student, had practically sprinted out the door the moment Bruce dismissed him, eager to escape the suffocating tension that had settled into the room. Only Bruce and Roxanne remained. The silence was absolute, save for the distant muffled hum of traffic on the Oakland streets outside. Roxanne finally stood up. Her legs were stiff. She tossed the warm, useless bag of water into a rusted trash can by the bleachers. It hit the bottom with a wet slap. She walked over to her boots, still sitting in a messy pile near the edge of the mat. She sat heavily on the wooden border and began to pull them on, struggling to manage the thick laces with only her left hand. Her right arm hung limply at her side, practically useless. Bruce was sitting on the canvas in the center of the ring, his legs splayed out in a wide stretch. He was leaning forward, his chest pressed flat against the floor, a position that looked anatomically impossible. He didn't look up as she wrestled with the laces. "It was the angle," Roxanne said suddenly. Her voice was raspy, cutting through the silence like a dull saw. Bruce stopped his stretch. He sat up slowly, crossing his legs into a lotus position. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. "I dropped my weight perfectly," she continued, her eyes fixed on the knot she was trying to tie one-handed. "I had the momentum. If you had tried to sprawl, I would have run right through you. If you had stepped back, I would have caught your ankles. You didn't do either." Bruce rested his forearms on his knees. The irritation was gone from his face, replaced by a quiet, serious intensity. "You gave me your structure," he said simply. "You committed all your mass to a forward trajectory. When you do that, you become a freight train without a steering wheel." "You hit my neck," she said, finally looking up at him. "But that wasn't what dropped me." "No," Bruce agreed. He uncrossed his legs and stood up, walking slowly toward her. His left knee popped audibly with the first step. He stopped a few feet away, hooking his thumbs into the waistband of his track pants. "The neck check just stopped your upward momentum. The throw came from the underhook. You handed me a lever, your right arm. I jammed my forearm into the armpit and twisted. I moved your shoulder past the plane of your knee. Once your shoulder goes past your knee, gravity does the rest." Roxanne nodded slowly. There was no magic to it, no mystical energy. It was brutal, uncompromising physics. She had spent 10 years utilizing leverage on the ground, but she had never seen it applied in a fraction of a second against a fully committed, dynamic takedown. The armbar was just cruel, though, she added, a dry, cynical smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Bruce didn't smile back, but the hard lines around his eyes softened slightly. "You're a catch wrestler. If I let you hit the ground without tying up a limb, you would have scrambled. I couldn't afford to grapple you. You're too heavy. I had to break the machine before it could start working." He reached down and picked up her right boot, which was still unlaced. He knelt on one knee, carefully favoring the left, and began to lace it for her. His hands moved with an incredible practiced dexterity. Roxanne watched his fingers fly over the thick leather strings. "You're hurt," she noted quietly. Bruce paused for a microsecond, his thumb slipping on a lace before resuming. "Everyone is hurt. Your left knee. You're dragging it slightly. You shouldn't be snapping those high kicks with a damaged hinge." "I don't have the luxury of resting it," Bruce said, pulling the laces tight and tying a sharp double knot. He stood back up. "People pay to see the kicks. They expect the legend." He sounded exhausted, utterly, fundamentally depleted. Roxanne understood. She looked around the empty, smelling gym, the peeling paint, the water stains on the ceiling, the chalk dust settled into the cracks of the floorboards. This was the reality of their lives. The pain wasn't an obstacle. It was the currency they used to buy a few moments of relevance in a world that would happily grind them into dust and forget them tomorrow. She stood up. She tested her weight on her boots. She felt stable, even if her arm was screaming in protest. "I've wrestled men twice your size," Roxanne said, looking him dead in the eye. "Lumberjacks, steel workers, guys who could bend a crowbar. None of them ever made me feel like I didn't know how to fall." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever given an opponent. Bruce nodded once, a sharp, respectful dip of his chin. "You have a good shot, but you telegraph it with your eyes. You look at the hips before you drop your level. A blind man could time it." Roxanne let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. It hurt her ribs, but it felt genuine. "I'll keep that in mind the next time I try to rip someone's legs off." She turned and walked toward the heavy gymnasium door. She pushed it open with her good shoulder. The blinding, humid heat of the late California afternoon flooded into the dark gym, carrying the smell of exhaust fumes and salty ocean air. She didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing the quiet back inside. Bruce stood alone in the dim light. He looked down at his calloused knuckles, then down at the scuff marks Roxanne's boots had left on the pristine edge of his mat. He reached down and rubbed his left knee, feeling the dull, familiar grinding of bone and cartilage. He walked over to the dented tin bucket, picked up his ratty yellow towel, and draped it over his neck. The heavy air of the gym settled around him, smelling of wintergreen and old canvas. He took a deep breath, perfectly inflating his ribs, and walked back to the center of the ring. He closed his eyes. There was always another challenger waiting in the shadows. There was always another lesson in gravity. He settled his weight, ignored the ache in his joints, and began to throw his punches at the empty air. Hiss, hiss, snap. The sound echoed in the empty room, a solitary heartbeat in the fading light. Enjoyed this deep dive into the untold, gritty reality of martial arts legends? The stories they don't tell on the silver screen are always the most fascinating. If you felt the impact of this encounter, hit that like button, drop a comment below on what martial arts myth we should explore next, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. We bring you raw, unfiltered storytelling every single week. Don't miss the next fight.